This podcast episode was originally recorded for Mormon Sex Info and is being refurbished for your enjoyment.
Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening.
This is Natasha Helfer of Mormon Sex Info, and I am super excited to have Jennifer Gonzales with me tonight, and I'm going to get into why we're having this conversation in just a minute. But before I do that, I would love for you to introduce yourself, because I know that you're pretty fabulous and I see a lot of paperwork. See a lot of wallpaper back there, lady.
Okay, well, how would I describe myself? I am a teacher and a coach, kind of at the core of my professional abilities. I have spent the last 20 years doing a range of consulting and facilitation and teaching at the college level, and then did this little stint in law school where I learned how to make movies in between reading case books. And I guess you could say like developing a more systematic approach to human-centered design. And so I really think of myself as a designer and as a facilitator, and I don't know, just a helper in helping people to rethink the way that they individually and collectively in organizations approach relationships with each other.
Okay, well, that's all very fabulous. So I just happened to meet you at a Sunstone symposium not that long ago. And I don't know, just had a really cool
last year?
Maybe last year, maybe
2
the
years
year
ago,
before, because last year was COVID and there was no.
It was the year before.
Yeah.
It was
we had
before
a
times.
conversation, and you were talking about a lot of issues with kind of like immigration with between Mexico and the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, really good conversation. I haven't really talked to you since then, but after my experience this week, I don't know why, but I thought I want to talk to Jennifer. So that was kind of what started this. And I'll tell you why I wanted to talk to you, because I felt like I had a very emotional week, right? And that week was broadcasted by either myself or by other people, broadcasting the events that led to my excommunication, and also just witnesses that wasn't necessarily broadcasted, but could, like, for example, the Sunday leading up to the council, there were a lot of people in my home and they got to interact with me in a way that they probably haven't been used to interacting with me. And I was also, very.
We call that unfiltered.
Unfiltered, yes. I was very unfiltered. Thank you. And so I thought to myself, I think I have always had this very strong Argentine mother who could rant for hours when she was grumpy with us, not in a scary way. Like, we'd all be like, okay, it's just time to listen to mom. We messed up, so it's time for a 3-hour lecture. She's ranting around the house.
Yeah.
In a loving way.
You gotta work through it. You gotta work through all the feelings.
And that's how she would love us too, right? If there was any problems or whatever, it was like lots of love and lots of conversation and lots of emotion and hand stuff. And
right.
I have that. And then of course I had my very kind of stoic Germanic English Asperger father who barely ever showed any emotion at all.
Feelings are for plebeians.
So I I wondered, I thought to myself, I was getting feedback from my friends and from my colleagues that they were concerned about me. And in some ways I agreed, especially because of the sleep deprivation. And
That'll
because
do it.
I was just kind of like, dung, 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 dung. Yes, I knew that I was doing that. But then I really thought, what if there's a part of these people that don't understand this part of me that I don't really ever show, which is this kind of unfiltered, different kind of cultural space that, like, for example, when I spent some time in Argentina with my family there and would sit down to the dinner tables, right? It was like lots of interrupting, lots of loud voices, and even like, you're full of it, and that's not what the president is doing, right? Like the politics.
A passionate exchange.
Time the tiramisu was being passed around and everybody had a glass of wine. We were all like best friends again, right?
Right. My mother is German descent. My father is Mexican. And my dad once asked me, how would you describe our family culture? I think it was my mother. She was taking some teaching class. Our family culture. I said, well, Mexicans are always right and Germans are never wrong. Yeah, that's family. And then it happens.
Right.
Yeah.
So I thought to talk to you and see, what's your take on how you think I've been acting? Not that I had expected you to be watching or anything, but just, I just tried to explain, like, I think this is what's been happening. And
I caught you in the newsfeed here and there.
Okay. What do you think? So I guess I'd like to just turn it over to you and maybe share with the audience a little bit about what that conversation between you and I was like, and what you noticed maybe I was worried about, or some of the things that you felt were important to tell me. And we can just kind of try to replicate that discussion as much as possible. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I think that's about right. I think too, having kind of been in this Mormon in between space, right, of leaving the church, whether we call ourselves ex-Mormons or any gazillion versions of this, enlightened Mormons I've heard, which I thought was funny. The white experience of it is fundamentally at this core level very different than being an outsider, being, whether that's a person of color or even just coming from a cultural background that is not, a Knutson or a Christiansen or right, like if you're not from the family's not from the British Isles or Sweden, what is it to exist in Mormonism and what is it to walk away from Mormonism? And I've spent a lot of time listening to white faith crisis stories and going, that's not what I experienced at all in a lot of ways. And I understand it and I see it and I recognize it. But I think our place in Mormonism is different. And therefore our extraction or distancing or reconfiguring of our relationship to it comes from a different place, follows a different process, and leads to a different outcome. And understanding that those are actually fundamentally different journeys, I think, is something that a lot of white Mormons, and especially disaffected Mormons, ex-Mormons, however they want to kind of categorize themselves, forget that they may be the default, but they're not universal. And so they tend to view other people's faith transitions and experiences with Mormonism and conflict through their own lens and through their, like, what would I be thinking or doing or going through that would cause me to act that way? Therefore, that must be what's wrong with you. And I've had my own experience with friends and I'm like, okay, whoa, wait a second. What I am doing and what you did when you had a similar path are actually fundamentally different, even though you think they're the same, right? Me going to speak at Sunstone is different than when you go to speak at Sunstone. Me choosing to rearrange my life and my values and the way that I do that is fundamentally different. We can talk about like sex. Approaching sex is a totally different experience because you come from a different experience. And I think as people of color, there's like a deep feeling when it collides, you're like you said, something's not lining up here, but we don't always have enough of the community conversation, right? To have dug into that and go, okay, well, what is causing this tension or this difference in experience that feels the same on the surface, looks the same a little bit, but like isn't fundamentally the same internally. And parsing that out, I think, is a challenge when you don't have, when you're on the margins of the marginalized community, right?
Right. Well, and it's even more complicated with me, I think, because, we talked a lot the other night about passing. Like, I consider myself Caucasian, I'm white, I pass as a white woman, and yet I do have a very different cultural experience, and I very much resonate with calling myself Latina, although I've always struggled with that too. Like I remember in the times of college when they were like, are you Latina or Hispanic? I would always put no, because I didn't want to take, I didn't want to claim like that I had been disenfranchised somehow because of my skin color.
Well, and one day you'll have to read, is it the creation of Latinos or the creation of Hispanic? I'll have to find the book title, but it talks about like how we created these identities as Latino and all of the racialization that's happening there and all of the complexity that's there. And what has been unaddressed in a lot of cultural contexts is what is it to be white and Latino? Like I remember looking at the little demographic thing, and it was always white, not of Hispanic descent. I was like, well, I'm not white. And then they separated out race and culture and like ethnicity. So you could be white and you could be Hispanic or Latino. But those are fundamentally different experiences, right? Especially in the United States, where you're sort of politically, from a media standpoint, lumped together because of the language, like the ancestral language of Spanish. And yet, anyone will tell you Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans have never quite seen eye to eye and do not engage in the world in remotely similar ways, unless we're with a bunch of white people who don't really differentiate us very much. And then to be right from somewhere like Argentina, to have European ancestry, but Latin American ancestry, and your descendants of colonial, but not, not English, Germanic. So it's, the Spanish, the Portuguese is all very messy. The immigrant experience is all very messy. So there's an otherness that doesn't quite fit.
Right.
It's messy. It's
like
really, really messy.
My mother's family, like her paternal side is all Italian immigrants. And my mother's probably like, I want to say 4th generation Argentine. I mean, so it's been a while.
Right. So you have a cultural, national identity, you have an ethnic identity, you have this ancestral identity.
And then her mother's side was actually very European, like it's Estonian and Austrian. So it's like, even in her Argentine, kind of blending, my mom is whiter than I am, as far as skin tone. I think I get a little bit of my olive skin actually from my dad's Jewish side.
Right.
So
yeah. And Judaism is a really interesting, like, to be Jewish in America is to not be white in the same ways, but also you're not a person of color, right? It's a very complex intersection there, because I am the granddaughter of a Stanford educated attorney who has a street named after his family in Nauvoo, who referred to me and my siblings as my mother's bastard Mexican children. A German immigrant who came at the age of 6 on a boat to the port of Los Angeles. We didn't even go through like Angel Island or anything. No. We took the weird ways. Who was raised to assimilate but also to embrace her German identity. And so it was this very weird thing where my mother was German, my father was Mexican, and I was not claimed. I could say my dad is brown and my mom is German, but nobody said we are German. We are Mexican. This is who we are. It was, this is who I am. I don't know who you kids are. What we're hoping is you kids will turn out white and Mormon. That's what we're hoping. And then I showed up, and they used to call my dad was teaching seminary on the reservation. And my mom says, everyone would come and go, oh, you have a little Navajo baby. And so they would talk to her and they would be nice to her, whereas before they would ignore her. So I was her token brown child, which was really nice for the first couple of years. And then we moved out of the reservation and I betrayed the assimilation of my family, right? You can't look at me and think, oh, they're basically white. Mm-hmm. And that created a lot of internal conflict in the family, right? That I'm deeply working through wonderful therapists with. Mm-hmm. But also like I had to create an identity. And I think for a lot of, especially mixed background Latinos in the United States, right? We are having to redefine our identities, both ancestrally, and it's a very complicated space, mm-hmm. right? Because there's all these intersections of diaspora and indigeneity, and they play out in very different ways in any different person, right? And so this idea of Latinos as like any sort of group, I think is very quickly breaking down, but we're not sure what to do with it, mm-hmm. right? And I think that amplifies within Mormonism in a weird way.
Some people are writing in, we don't understand what you're talking about. Recap that I reached out to Jennifer because really, and I'm just going to say it very plainly. I felt like I showed up like myself on Sunday and Monday, including a little bit of my manic energy because I was sleep deprived. But I felt from a lot of my community, like I felt their concern, which was very loving. I interpret it as like she's losing it. She's going crazy. Mm-hmm. Like she's having a mental breakdown. Whereas I was feeling like I'm just being Latina and I'm showing my mother's energy and I have a lot of feelings and you're all going to have to deal with it. And then all of my Mormon friends and colleagues who have never seen me like that were like, we think
you broke out of your whiteness that they had like very like you. I mean, I didn't even know you were Argentine, right? Like I was like, okay, Latina, that's interesting. Well, I can't wait to hear this story. I'm looking at your pictures being like, okay. I mean, my entire family my siblings all look like we're different ethnicities, right? So we all look the same and then also from different countries. It's very bizarre because genes are weird. But yeah, you existed in the culture and in the zeitgeist of Mormonism, and particularly this little corner of progressive, I don't know what we call ourselves, but this sort of marginalized space in Mormonism as a white woman. And then you did not follow the script. That was the most unwaspy behavior. And if I believe you are waspy, if I believe you are white, then something is wrong with you, because that's not how white women act until they're on the brink, if not over. At least that's the narrative, right? And we see this because we demonize these behaviors in people of color, right? Oh, you're so loud and it's ignorant and it's uncontrolled. And we have all this demonizing language that we put on the fact that you have feelings and that you speak, and let alone do it with any intensity, you're dangerous.
Which has been experienced all along in Mormonism. My loud laugh, my ability to crack up, and I'm always like using my hands and I'm clapping my legs.
The demonstrative nature of it.
Crushed, like shh. So that's been largely my experience.
And here's the difference. I don't get shushed, I get eye rolls, and I get people who just kind of step away. You get shushed because you're inside and you just don't know the rules, or you've lost focus. There's a certain way to behave and we need to remind you.
Right.
Whereas when people of color do that, people go, right? And so there's a very interesting distinction there that happens based not on who you are, but on how you are perceived in that community.
Yeah. Right. No, that's really interesting. And so I think Yeah, I think that's what was painful for me was, because I had to kind of reassess myself, because I'm always willing to reassess myself. And sometimes when I've been called out, I'm like, oh yeah, yep. But this
Right.
time around, it didn't resonate as much for me. And so then, I'm kind of sitting in this space where I'm doubting myself, right? But, and I think you're right, because I typically do pass as white at, period.
You code switched without permission.
Right. And then plus people usually see my professional side, my
Right.
friends have probably seen my crazy side a little bit, like when we're doing karaoke and going out and having fun,
But that's very contextual, right? That's not seen as the way that you are. That's how you are in those spaces. And right now, right, you were in a Mormon space, in a formal space, right, a church court, and on the internet, and speaking in a public space.
Yeah.
And you brought your private self into a public space, and it didn't look like their private selves, which is, be taken the wrong way talking to a sex therapist, but yeah.
No, I got it.
No double entendre meant there.
I actually love the double. Always so much.
We'll talk about the pink pussy hat someday.
Yeah, why can't it have been a brown pussy hat?
Oh, pink's not universal.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Even amongst white women, it's not universal.
Right.
Oh, where was I going with that? I think that, being a therapist in general, I mean, I've talked about kind of, in my Mormon Stories interview years ago with John, where I kind of finally talked about my own story a little bit. Just having a therapist persona has like a certain implication. Like you're supposed to have it all together. You're supposed to always act, in every space, like you would, encourage people to work.
Well, you're not supposed to show up as a person. You're supposed to show up as a fixture. That is there, right? We talk about like your therapist is someone to reflect back to, like you really are sort of trying to objectify yourself in a way so that the other person can fully inhabit the space. Right. And so that's just, and what better training for showing up as only a shell of who you are than a lifetime of Mormonism.
I would say yes. Yes. I think too, like, I mean, I've been to Mormon wards in Latino countries, or even in Spanish speaking wards, here in the United States. I haven't been to the Tongan wards or things like that, but my brother has, and we always talk about how it's so different, and we feel more at home in those wards than the white wards, right?
My second to last year in attending church, I had moved home to Utah and I was living at my parents' house, and I was absolutely not going to be going to church with my parents in their ward in Hobble Creek, where I did not grow up. They moved when I was in college, but they'd been there 20 years. And I was like, I know your neighbors. I'm not doing that. I'm barely showing up to church. So I went to the Spanish speaking ward that met down the street. And I was amazed at how many people in the ward, because officially it was a Spanish ward. It's not a Latino ward, right? But how many people in the ward were second, third generation English, fully English speaking, but they came to this ward because it felt better to be there. And even where my Spanish wasn't great, like half the time I'm like, oh, it was kind of nice, because if I didn't pay attention, I couldn't really understand what was being said unless I was focused on it. So when they started saying things that were annoying me, I would just like zone out. And it was just like, wow, I was like Charlie Brown, which was helpful for that last like round of Sunday school lessons before I was like, yeah, no, this isn't working here. Right. But I was amazed at how many people chose that ward, not because they quote unquote needed to, right, but because it was a place where they felt like they could be themselves and they could be honored and respected for themselves in a way that they never felt that way in those white sort of local wards.
Right. Well, and I think, I always try to expand from Mormonism. Like this just doesn't happen in Mormonism. Like I think about, like, for example, Jackie Onassis, when I see her responding to this very traumatic event in her life where see her crawling out of the car and her husband is I mean, what a moment, right? And yet at the funeral, there she is, the epitome stoic and elegant, and keeping her children tidy and not even shedding a tear. And she's applauded for that by the American audience. Like, look at how graceful and how poised, and wow. Whereas, you know, in Latino cultures, you're really crying and showing emotion.
We would be like, did she not like her husband? Oh, I guess the rumors were true that they didn't actually get along, because she's not crying at all.
Super happy that he's a goner.
Right.
And then
that's a whole different novella plot right there.
Yeah. And then you see the African, some of the African women like actually lying on the tomb and like even ripping their hair and, you know, scratching their faces and like really like just emoting, you know.
So Mormonism does grief terrible. And I think it does grief terrible in large part because it is this amplification of white supremacist culture, of like settler colonial culture. Like we talk about Mormonism as a very white space, and even that it has, but like Mormonism is a caricature of white American culture, right? It's taken all of this sort of superficial media driven identity of what it is to be, you know, the 1950s sort of Americana, and it's institutionalized them. And the entire purpose of that whole identity and that lifestyle and everything that has come to be sort of middle, upper class, more, you know, American white, was designed to create and perpetuate whiteness, was designed like specifically with racist underpinnings, right? Because it came at a time when there was massive class disruption after the war. Any old farmer's kid could go to college, right? And we had to reassert the racial hierarchies in really aggressive ways, right? In order to make sure that everyone stayed in their place.
Can you talk more about that? Like what kinds of things would you show as examples of that?
I mean, the first thing I think of is like Mad Men, right? Think about the sort of family structure of Mad Men and that whole culture of we don't talk about our feelings, we don't air our dirty laundry. There's all of these laws of propriety. And really what it comes down to is how do we, as formerly working and lower middle class people, right, who have now entered the upper middle class, which is this pantomime of high society, right? How do we show that we belong here rather than down there, where the brown and the black people are? And so we have to, right? And my father was a fundraiser growing up, and we would laugh that nobody is so stuck up as somebody who doesn't have real money, but wants everyone to think they are. Like those are the worst, right? Is the upwardly mobile. Mormonism took that little niche of Americana and like blessed it with, you know, chosen peopleness. Yeah. Like for 40 years, we had the same haircut from our missionaries that was like soldiers home on leave, right? Like the corporate American look was designed to take folks who were not moneyed, right? This is new money, and create a culture where they could perpetuate this class and this racial sort of identity separate then and superior to people of color who were coming out of, you know, poverty, coming out of the South, coming out of, right, like pushing back on Jim Crow, because we're now a couple generations away and the world is shifting. And the world wars and the technological revolution of that period definitely created this mix, you know, shook things up. And whiteness was like, keep it all in place. How do we keep the status quo when there's change demand, right? Oh, so we create all these barriers to cultural entry that we can, and they're driven by white culture. They're driven by that like Western European bourgeoisie, right? Like that is the identity that becomes not only aspirational from an economic standpoint, but now from a cultural and religious standpoint, right? And Mormonism did that hardcore.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, instead of getting defensive about these things when we're the white people hearing people like you speak so eloquently about this, it's just like patriarchy with men. These systems hurt everybody. I mean, they hurt, obviously, they hurt us at different levels.
Well, they hurt everybody. They don't oppress everybody.
Yes.
And that's a distinction.
Yeah.
Because even though they cause harm, but in exchange for benefit, right? Like if you're of the privileged class, then you get a benefit. And this is kind of one of the things we talk about. And I've said this to a lot of people. I said, the white Mormon faith crisis that I've observed, and go listen, I'm not a big John Dehlin fan, but we'll just leave it at that. You go listen to those stories and there is just a pattern, right? You start to hear there's about 4 different archetypes of the faith crisis. And we hear versions of that over and over and over again. Like it's become almost like a folklore. And when I hear those, what I hear often is, I was raised to believe that I was entitled to a certain kind of privilege if I only followed the rules. So I followed the rules and I didn't get that privilege for some reason. And now I'm mad and I feel betrayed by the church. I was supposed to get married and have babies, and I was supposed to have my husband's supposed to be a dentist and we have a nice house, and or the men who are like, I was going to be a bishop and then a stake president. I should have been a general authority. Like we joke about the I should have been a general authority complex that so many ex-Mormons sort of public figures have. And it's all couched in this. I was supposed to have privilege. I paid the price for my privilege by giving up my identity, by following the rules, by not following my own interests and desires. How dare you not offer me power and position? Right. And it's why even so many,
like, how dare you not give me credibility? Right. Like,
right. And how many faith crises come in tandem with or on the heels of a divorce, infertility, like any one of these sort of like, I did it right and it didn't turn out right. And inherent in that is I was supposed to have privilege. Because I'm me and I played by the rules. And what I tell my white friends is, you don't understand. I was never supposed to have privilege in that system. I exist in that system to be the humble brown people, to be the nanny, to be the housekeeper. I'm there to serve others. I'm there to give them diversity. I'm there, right? And they'll take even they'll take my teaching. They'll let me be a Relief Society teacher, but I will never be a Relief Society president. I can serve, I can give, but I don't get power and position, right? And Mormonism, you talk to other people of color and they'll be like, yeah, no, like I was not marriage material because I was brown. Right. There's a whole dynamic of brown women are there to fuck around with, and they don't count as sin. We can get in, that's a whole beast. And so when you exist
there was policy in place that you weren't supposed to marry outside of your race or culture. I remember hearing that as a young woman and worrying about my parents, because my American dad had married an Argentine mother, and hearing that and going, wow, did my parents sin because they got married?
I got that from my parents, who are in a mixed ethnic marriage. But my father is famously assimilationist in his approach, right? And so there's some really interesting complexity that goes with that. And it comes down to this: I was supposed to be white, and my inability to pass as white was a problem. And so, like, my father would talk about, well, you got to marry someone tall, you got to marry someone this way, you got to improve the gene pool.
Wow.
And when my first niece was born and she had blonde hair and blue eyes and very white skin, my mother said, I always wanted a little girl who looked like me. My mother, as her 3 brown daughters are sitting there, being like,
wow.
oh, okay. There's a reason we don't have a relationship right now.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
Right. But those attitudes were very Mormon. Were very much informed by Mormonism and by the Mormon experience, because Mormonism, from my parents, especially coming from immigrant families and from brown families, right? Mormonism was the pathway into whiteness, was the pathway into prosperity. So I'm, not only a failure and a heathen, I'm a betrayal. Because look at everything we gave up. We gave up our culture, we gave up our family, we gave up our people, we gave up our entire identity so that we could be white. Now what?
Yeah.
Right. And the rejection of that is a violation within the system. Right. And the family might reflect that, but like the bigger system is like, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. Right. We allowed you to be here as long as you served a purpose. My favorite experience was being at BYU and I was at some dance, right? Some guy asked me to dance and he's like, oh, where are you? I don't know. I said something, well, I'm half Mexican, right? Probably what's your ethnicity? But in some very awkward white way was asked me. And instantly, oh, I served my mission in Mexico and blah, 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 blah. And let me throw it a little bit. Let me speak Spanish to you with loud music pounding in your ears when you're a second language. I was like, I'm not following, honey. And he complimented me on my English because it didn't even have an accent. It was just pristine English because, it's my first language. And then when I said, well, I'm not actually from Mexico, he's like, well, do you have like family there? Like I was like, no, I'm like third generation. And my grandfather was an orphan and my grandmother was border people. So the border crossed them. It's all very complicated, but no, I'm like an American minority. And he went, oh, nice to meet you, and walked away. Because I was supposed to be exotic.
So you weren't Mexican enough to be.
I wasn't properly brown in that context. My job was to be exotic, right? Which is pedestalization, right? This is a form of benevolent racism. Oh, you're so cool and exotic. I can collect you. How many men collect women from their missions, right? And then bring them into a culture where they have no social, economic, political standing. So they are fully dependent on their white husband to be their access to anything, right? Like, and so we do this but we do this in America. We do this in white culture. And that's one of the big, one of my personal conversations that I've been working through is I can walk away from Mormonism, but I don't walk away from white supremacy. I don't walk away from patriarchy.
Right.
That voice,
right,
that everyone's like, yeah, I left Mormonism and I feel free. Isn't that cute for you?
Well, right. And I don't even think that even in the white context, I'm constantly seeing those same things happening in the post-Mormon communities, right? So,
right. Well, we carry our baggage.
I mean, yeah. So, but yeah, you're not free of systems that are systemic in every aspect of the word.
But we just move into a place where, in some ways, it's not that you're free of patriarchy, but you move into a place where you can then reclaim the privilege. We move into liberal spaces where we can be good liberal Karens. And then see we're back on top. Which is why it's not an act of liberation to leave that system behind and recreate it.
Yeah, right.
Climbing up the totem pole, climbing up the food chain to a better version of privilege is still standing on other people. And I think a lot of white progressive and ex-Mormons, right, as they decenter the church and even walk away from Mormonism as sort of an institution, their goal is not deconstruction. Their goal is not liberation. Their goal is to build a new system where they're on top, following the exact same structures as before, but just putting different value, realigning the values so that the privilege falls on them. And that's not change.
Right.
That's a costume change. right? That's taking your show on tour. Wow, Cleveland really liked you guys. You're still not Broadway.
Right. Well, I plan on having several more conversations with you in the future, because I think that this is even how I maybe interact with my clients going through faith transitions, is a lot of what you're talking about. What are your new values? What are your new interests? How can you find meaning outside of this system? But I'm not sure that I'm bringing in enough of what you're talking about to really allow for the type of deconstruction that would be more healthy or more profound anyway.
Right.
Just
Well, and like I said, because the faith crisis is brought on by a crisis of privilege, then the disaffective, I don't know what we call that, that process of realignment, that process of recreation of self continues to be in pursuit. Like the leaving of Mormonism is in pursuit of privilege that we thought we were entitled to. And so we're just, right. And that, I think that's why ex-Mormons as a collective have such a hard time leaving behind the systemic parts of it, right? Like all the same bullshit happens at Sunstone as happens at state conference. Except we do it with gummies and alcohol and we think we're edgy.
Right. Well, yeah.
But I was totally drunk. And so I was a bad Mormon. And so it's not Mormon. I'm like, no, everything about that. You were a drunk Mormon.
You were naughty Mormon.
Right.
Can you give an example of what if you could, maybe simplistically, which is, but if somebody was to go through that path in kind of a different way than what you're now describing, what do you see that looking like?
I think it has to come in the claiming of something new rather than the rejection of something old. And this, I actually had this really interesting conversation. This might be a fun one for us to have, because I was talking to my current partner, my boyfriend, who's a lovely man. And I was talking about all of the ex-Mormon sort of wave of, I'm going to be polyamorous. And really, I'm just going to like really have some bad behavior out there and do a lot of damage to myself and others. And he practices ethical non-monogamy, and we're in a non-monogamous relationship. And so we talk about, he's like, why are you so different than the way you describe so many other Mormons, and even the Mormons that I've met who've left? Like, what's different here? And I said, well, I didn't feel betrayed by Mormonism. First of all, it had never had my interests at stake, and therefore this whole like, I can't believe the church would do this to me. I'm like, you can't believe that religion is stories that are not factually like verifiably true? I'm pretty sure that's the definition of mythology. Like, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but like, it's all stories. What do you mean it was supposed to be true? It was supposed to be true because it was my ancestors. It was my, right? It was me. It was this. And I'm like, yeah, that was never true for me. What I went looking for when I left Mormonism was, this isn't fulfilling my needs. I need more depth. I need better spirituality. I need different community. And I went looking for community. I didn't set out to leave Mormonism. I set out to get my needs met. And in doing that, I found myself creating a life that was authentic, that increasingly looked less and less Mormon, until I hit a moment where I realized I can't ever go back, because there's no place for me as I am there. I can't go back to Mormonism and just be like a cultural Mormon, reading my tarot cards and talking to my dead grandmas and not having babies and not being a soccer mom. And I'm doing it all very, very radically different. And I made each of those choices, not because they weren't Mormon, but because I was trying to figure out what resonated with me.
Right.
And when your journey into change is driven by a sense of victimization rather than a sense of like, I am going to claim myself, right? I think that becomes really a challenge. I also think that the choices that we make along the way have to be done mindfully and with a purpose that is not about rejection of Mormonism. right? And so one of the things I talk a lot about with my friends is I know a lot of folks who, when they decide that they sort of want out, the first thing they do is they go out and they get drunk or they try drugs and they have sex outside of marriage. And and I've asked people, I'm like, well, why did you do that? And they said, because then I knew I wouldn't be comfortable going back to church, so I wouldn't fall back into it. And so it's this equivalent. I have a younger sister who deals with like disordered eating. And so one of her tactics to keep herself from just like snacking is when she's done with her meal, she pours water on her plate, like at a restaurant. She dumps a water glass on and then she can't eat anymore because it's gross. And I'm like, oh, so that's what you did. You're like, well, if I go fuck around and drink coffee and get drunk, now I'm a sinner. And so I have to carve out a space outside of Mormonism because I no longer belong. And I'm like, but why did you choose those? You chose those because those are culturally these defining features, not because you were claiming your own sexuality, not because you were claiming your own body, not because you were pursuing, right, an experience authentically that you felt like this was the best way to achieve that. There was nothing mindful about those choices. Well, it was fuck you all.
Yeah. And that totally makes sense because those skills aren't taught in Mormonism.
No.
Right?
And in fact, Mormonism defines itself in antithesis, right? Everything about us is we're not like the other churches, right? The Joseph Smith story starts with, who are we? We're nobody else. Which church is true? None of them. We're going to be the none of them church. Well, that's not anything. Right? That's the University of Utah back in the 80s, who was not BYU. You don't, outside of Utah, like, right? And they have some wonderful programs now. I think there's a great institution in many ways. Like, I don't want to start that with people, but I remember coming from outside of Utah and then moving outside of Utah, and people knew BYU and nobody knew about the University of Utah outside of Utah. And my friends were like, yes, but the U is so much better. I was like, no, you're just not BYU. That's not an identity outside of BYU. Right? I think UVU went through that. People were like, we're not BYU students. I'm like, well, who are you? We're kids who could have gone to BYU or couldn't have gone and chose not to, and we're not you. So we define ourselves in the negative, and we create these spaces that look exactly like what we've rejected.
Yeah. No, I do talk a lot about that, like, because I think it's part of the healing process to do the rejection, but that's not, you're never going to find your identity in the rejection. You have to find what you are about, and
right.
Many people coming out of Mormonism, especially I think white Mormonism, have never been given that opportunity. I think in your point, really, people of color in Mormonism have had to take that opportunity because they never fit into really begin.
And I would push back on the never had the opportunity.
Yeah.
I think they never had the motivation. Because the motivation to conform, right? We talk about, it was so heavy pressure from the culture, but why did you feel heavy pressure from the culture to conform and I didn't? Because I knew no matter what I did, I would never conform.
Right. And I think that's of like the LGBTQ community.
Right. And so the queer experience becomes very different. If you were a hetero white second generation Mormon who was a believer, you believed that you could at some point attain those privileges. And you were just upset that it didn't pan out the way the commercial had told you. And that's very different than saying, I reject this colonization of myself and I will claim me from the inside out. Right. And I'm guessing with a lot of your clients, it's working from the outside in. And then they get to that core and they're like, ta-da, I found me. No. Now you got to dismantle all the way back out. You're halfway to that journey when you find yourself. Yeah. And whiteness tells you, good, you found yourself. You're done. Yeah. Like, it was so funny. I had a friend who's a therapist, and I recommended that he read My Grandmother's Hands by Mencken about transgenerational trauma and racial trauma. And, and he leaves me this message as Marco Polo about like, I feel like I'm well on my way to healing from white body supremacy. And I was like, oh, honey. I was like, first of all, I have always lived my life outside of it. And I would say that I've been taking very mindful, conscious rejection and healing steps away from it for a solid 10 years. And I am scratching through the surface.
Right.
You read 2 chapters in a weekend, sweethearts. You're not even close. Like, oh, freshman psych 101 student, bless your hearts.
Right.
And they're like, oh, I know things.
In a lot of ways, you're right. I think this is an ongoing journey. We don't really ever get to the end of this journey. I don't think.
It's a practice. It's a way of living. It's not a destination.
Right.
And if it is a destination, it's a multi-generational destination.
Yeah.
And
all progress has been multi-generational.
And what they don't tell you about being a cycle breaker or a change person is you never get to live in the world that you create.
Mm-hmm.
You always get to live in the mess.
Yeah.
And for a lot of folks, there is an entitlement that comes to play that gets really, and I think a lot of white folks do, but if I fight racism or you name your social justice issue, I should get to be treated and enjoy the success of that world.
Right.
Which means I just created it for myself, which means I didn't actually create anything. I just isolated myself enough so I could pretend like it wasn't happening. And I think there has to be this recognition that if we are going to create change, the first agreement we have to make is we're going to build a world that we wish we could live in so that someone else can live there.
Yeah.
I'm not building it for me.
It's like first immigrant parents a lot of times. It's like they come with a lot of education or a lot of knowledge to countries and are treated like crap and have stupid jobs, and maybe their kid can go to the university, right? Or their grandkid.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's that multi-generational lens of I'm creating a world that I wish I could have had, but I will never have had that childhood. I will never have had that world. Yeah. I will always be in battle. And I have to just choose. I have to acknowledge that is the world that I'm living in.
Yeah. All right. So let's pivot just slightly because the reasons why I got in trouble were, like masturbation, pornography, gay marriage. So, sex stuff.
Yeah.
Sex.
I mean, basically encouraging people to be murderers. So I can see why.
Next to murderers, Jennifer.
Next to murderers. You're like in the next cell over. I don't understand what that means, but I
don't either.
Interestingly, as a lawyer, murderers tend to get the average incarceration of someone who commits homicide is 8 years. So it's less than a 10-year bid to kill somebody.
Wow.
Which,
just be telling people that.
I'm just saying. Now, deal drugs, and you're gonna be in there for the rest of your life.
Oh yeah, marijuana, right? Like
right.
Especially if you're black or brown, for sure. Anyway, we digress. Okay, so, but I collected thousands of stories. I have no idea, how many of those stories are white, brown, black, but I can imagine just from the
demographics
of Mormonism that they're 95% white stories, right? At least. So what do you want to say about that? Like, as I move forward, maybe, and I'm going to have actually conversations with you in depth, but can you talk a little bit about, we've been talking, I think, a lot about the lived experience of a white Mormon versus a person of color. And I've been seeing a lot of the wows and oh my goodness, and a lot about this type of comments.
Okay. I like to mix it up for people.
Yeah. Well, what about this? Because I think the Mormon sexual shame story affects all of us, but now there's an intersection of all these other things, which is also true of the American story. Like Black women are treated very differently sexually than Asian women, than Latina women, than white women. Like, they all have kind of their stereotypes, right? The Madonnas and the whores and the passives and the exotics and the
Well,
dangerous.
let me give you this. If the job of a Mormon woman is to give birth to Mormon sons, the job of a Mormon woman of color is to give birth to white children. And we fail at it quite a bit.
Well, I would hope so.
But that means that we are encouraged to marry white men, right? And that's a whole sexual dynamic that is messy and painful and ugly. And the number of women of color I know who married white men, and some of them have very like continuing to be married and have healthy relationships more or less, and others have been like, whoa, nope, not so much. But all of them have a moment where they're like, oh my God, I can't believe my husband, my spouse, my partner believes this about me and my children. Right? Mm-hmm. And what is it to look at your children, not as a disappointment for the choices they made, but for their mere existence as themselves. Right? And that I betray my parents because I have this skin and this body and this hair, right? I betrayed their attempts to whiten the family. And so that's different than just perpetuating the culture, right? So sex always intersects with this, like, what is the purpose of sex in Mormonism? Right, is patriarchal, right? It's the control of women, and it is the consolidation of power and wealth, right? And so sex becomes a place where that happens. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, and that's perpetuation of power and wealth. The more babies you have, the more the family continues to be a source of political power within the church and beyond the church, right? Like your babies are your currency in Mormonism.
Yeah.
And there is a little bit about,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, just your own personal experience. Like, if I was going to talk about like the lessons I learned and how I interpreted them as a young woman, and, I had some sexual abuse in my childhood, mm-hmm. and I had, I had a lot of things that, as I'm hearing like the object lesson, me and my story, mm-hmm. and I'm thinking of myself in certain ways. What was that like for you?
It was interesting because I was given a lot of narratives about my sexuality. I was supposed to be both hypersexualized and what's the word I'm looking for?
And you're talking about Mormonism, not Americanism, right?
It's kind of all of it, right? Like Mormonism's an interesting place because I was supposed to be the spicy Latina. I'm an English major. Mm-hmm. I mean, I have my spicy moments, but like, mm-hmm. I didn't grow up in community. I didn't grow up in a Mexican community. I didn't grow up with a Latino community. I grew up in white neighborhoods with a white mom and a dad who told me that that's why he married my mother, because she's the epitome of a beautiful woman, because she's white and blonde and has blue eyes and fair skin. I grew up with my brothers saying, I remember this one incident. My dad would always, and there's some drama and trash there. My dad would be like, oh, do you think that girl on TV is attractive? Like, to my brothers. This was always like a conversation that would be had in my house. And I remember watching Hitch one day and my dad being like, oh, hey, and I'm not including this conversation. We're just in the room. The boys are talking. Do you think that Eva Mendes is attractive? And all of my brothers were like, I don't really like Hispanic girls. They seem like they should be your cousins, not your girlfriend. I would never, none of the men in my family have dated or married brown women. All of both of my sisters-in-law are white. And the fact that I called that out actually led to me becoming completely estranged from my brother's family and his 5 children that I helped raise. So that's right all around this idea of I'm not equal to a white woman in the church. And that includes my sexuality, right? And like I said, we talk about, I was expected to be fetishized in a way that nobody told me I was right, because I was sitting in class with white girls being told all the things the white girls were, and that was not matching how I was moving in the world, both internally and externally. Right? I have always been a very embodied person. Like, I feel through my body, I experience through my, I'm a very sensory neurodivergent kind of person, and that didn't make sense. Right? Because I was supposed to not touch people. Like, I remember being accused of being super flirty and really sexually aggressive because I would touch people. I would hug people or put my hand on their arm or anything like that, because that's how I interact with people. Mm-hmm. And it was always hypersexualized, but never in a way that I was actually able to speak to that. It was all subtext, right? And when I would not play along, like, that anger of a white man becomes something new when it's me. Mm. And especially when it hits them on different levels. Like, I was shooting pool in the dorms at BYU, and I was just in a goofy mood. So I was just being silly and kind of flaky. And I could tell these guys were sort of engaging with me like I was the dumb girl who didn't realize that I was dumb. And so I could tell what they were doing. And I finally, at one point, I made some comment about, like, dude, I'm here on academic scholarship. And they made look, no way. I was like, yeah. They're like, what scholarship? I'm like, it's through the multicultural department. Oh, well, that makes sense. Mm-hmm. I'm like, I probably have a higher ACT score than you did. I have better grades than you do. I mean, I got a Stanford degree up there. So somebody thinks I'm pretty damn smart, but I'm like, they were just like, oh, well, that's bullshit. Mm-hmm. Because you're brown. I had men tell me, I had one good friend, and he said it to me in a trying to be very honest and candid. And we didn't have any romantic interest, so it wasn't really a rejection, but he told me, he's like, honestly, Jen, if you want me to be really blunt, you are not the woman that white Mormon missionary boys sit on their mission dreaming about coming home and marrying. You are not what anybody hopes for. If they marry me, it's because they're the black sheep of the family, because their families are a little bit marginalized and I'm the best they can do. And, my dad worked for BYU, so that gives them a little bit of clout. Like, no, I'm second prize, always, always second prize. I'm disposable.
Yeah.
And my sexuality and my body are disposable. And they're always a problem. Because, we can talk about curvy bodies and modesty culture, and I am an H cup. Mm-hmm. And I was a B cup in 4th, 5th grade. Mm-hmm. And so I was constantly told that I was being I dressed inappropriate. Mm-hmm. My shorts were too short and my shirt was and it was always a little comment. It was always a little comment from the leaders, like, well, it's a little harder for Jen. And, I remember I have never gone to the temple to do baptisms for the dead and had a bra that fit me, because they don't carry them in my size. Mm. Right? Like, my body is alien in Mormonism. And therefore it is treated as less than human, even more than just being a woman. Because a woman can be redeemed to be a mother. I can be redeemed by being a servant. I can be redeemed by being the housekeeper. I can be the token. But I never get to be the wife. That's not who I'm supposed to be. And that was told to me by the men that I dated. With the guy that I dated when I was 19. And it was this, weird little stealth Mormon dating situation where we spent Valentine's Day curled up on his couch, and I fell asleep on his shoulder while we watched a basketball game. And everyone in my ward kept saying, when are you guys going to get married? Because you've been together constantly. I was like, well, we're not technically dating. We're just friends. Mm-hmm. And when I told him finally, I was like, look, everyone thinks we're dating. We're basically, you come over and you're like, hey, does anyone want to go out? And I'm the only one dressed because my roommates all go to bed early. Oh, why don't I just take Jen? Oh, I'll just buy the ice cream. Like, all of these stealth dates, right? And I was like, why don't we just do this? Like, let's date. Let's see what's here. And he goes, honestly, I couldn't take a Mexican girl home to my parents in Idaho.
Yeah.
So this is fun and I really like you, but you're never going to be anything but a toy.
Yeah.
So there's no redemption of the brown woman in Mormonism. There's redemption of the white woman. It comes at a great cost. And I don't want to just undercut that it does come at a great personal cost, but it's in exchange for privilege. There is no privilege for me.
I just want to sit with that. I was thinking the whole time you were talking about the boys at BYU, most of them come from these missions where the better the mission, the hotter the wife, which is already problematic amongst white women.
And let's be honest, men who marry brown women from their missions and bring them home are of a different status than men who come home and marry the daughters of Christiansen families. And Hinkley's and all of that. Those are different classes of people. And it's almost like the Mormon equivalent of being a second son.
Yeah.
Right? You're not going to inherit the crown, so you can marry the brown girl.
Yeah, it's so interesting as I've been, I've reconnected with my Mexican American boyfriend. And in high school, I guess, I never even thought about it when we first dated. I notice it now, and I notice it in Utah in particular. When we go out, we're holding hands, we're sitting in a restaurant. Both of us will notice, the looks or the, sometimes he notices it.
People would ask my parents if all of the kids were from their marriage. They assumed we were a blended family because there was enough color variation that they just figured half of us. Basically, they thought that the sisters had from my dad's first marriage and my brothers had come from my mother's first marriage, and we were a blended family. They couldn't fathom the idea. And the interesting is, if you look at a black and white photo of me and my mother, we share very similar facial features. I look like my mother. Nobody believes me. You look like your dad. Right. No, I have my dad's coloration.
Right.
I don't look like my dad in the way that you know.
Right.
But I'm not allowed to look like my mother.
Well, and there's also all the assumptions about kids who are different colors being adopted, which sometimes is true, but it's not true, so. I
mean, we love our exotification and our tokenization in Mormonism. That's a whole nother conversation. But it's not mainstream and it's not accepted.
All right. Well, it's been an hour and a half, which is more than what I told you. But I hope we have more conversations. I know I've already told you I plan to consult with you, but I would like to, invite you at any point, just any point you want to talk about anything on a podcast, just say, hey, lady. And I'm like,
all right.
But I'd like to finish off just with, giving you an opportunity to say anything, kind of closing thoughts, or maybe something you were hoping I would ask that I haven't. And then, of course, also telling us, if we want to consult with you, or what are you doing? How do people get in touch with you? I think you have a lot of really services that you can offer. So those two things.
Okay. Closing statement. Moving up the food chain is not the same as liberation. And until white Mormonism, and particularly X sort of progmo world, reckons with that, the reality that they are driven first and foremost by privilege and not by liberation, there is nothing but the same old. If they want to move out of that cycle into a different way of being, if they that means letting go of that Mormon identity and the need to reclaim a position of privilege. And that is not a conversation I have heard anyone having in Mormon spaces at all.
Well, that's
right. But nobody's having them. Nobody's comfortable with them. And we need to sit there and think about why not.
Yeah.
Right. And we got to own our story. We got to own the fact that no, it wasn't necessarily the institution and the family pressure that made me do what I did. It was, I was not willing to go without right? I was not willing to be outside of Mormonism until I had no choice.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that say about the choices that I made and the way that I saw myself and the way that I see power and opportunity in the world?
Mm-hmm.
And why, and how am I carrying that with me?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's some deep introspection that I think we need to be doing both as individuals and as a collective.
Yeah. Well, and I
Right.
definitely called to that just listening to you. I can see lots of areas where I'm very much in that same boat. So I appreciate these conversations for sure.
Right. So I think we need to keep having that. Like, what does liberation actually look like?
Mm-hmm.
What does sexual liberation look like? What is religious liberation and ideological and social and cultural?
Yeah.
And there is no justice, there is no freedom unless it's collective.
Mm. Yeah.
Right.
Amen.
Yeah. All right. How can people get a hold of me? I mean, they can hunt me down on Facebook. Apparently that's my most public space. They can email me at jennifer@torchlightjustice.org.
Okay.
Which is
what's Torch?
Torchlight Justice Foundation is kind of my ongoing project right now. Exists in the iteration of a nonprofit, but it is the work that I have been doing for the last 5 to 10 years, starting with immigrant rights and rebuilding communities that are liberatory. And so that's kind of the umbrella of a lot of different projects that I've done and am working on. But that's my best email. I do facilitations and training. I've done curriculum development. I do corporate and individual coaching. I do community building, and I do systems design for organizations, all centered on.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, all centered on.
Yeah, management coaching, community coaching, leadership coaching. I did a long stint doing management and executive coaching with the federal government back before law school. I do storytelling and narrative development with people. Yeah, so a lot of that kind of, it's a very fuzzy space to work in.
Mm-hmm. But just to kind of understand the services. So obviously, yeah, like if you want like diversity training or things like that. But individually, it sounds like you can also do some personal work with.
Yeah. I have the capacity to sit with folks and help them, like kind of what we were doing, right? Let's work through understanding the connection between what's happening in my personal narrative and how that intersects with systemic narratives, and how do we find ourselves in that and then reframe, right, so that we can behave differently and we can make different choices, because it's fractals, right, all the way down. What's happening at the systemic level is about what's happening at a personal level times a million, right? And so, yeah, I do personal coaching with people. I guess life coaching, it might be the closest term, but I know that's life coaching has its connotations.
I think you have a specific niche where if people want to do some personal work around their own identity and how that interplays and ways.
Like finding your place in a path to liberation, both in the work that we're doing and how that plays out in our personal lives, I think is really this central question that I work with a lot of folks on. How do you walk that walk? How do you do that internal work once you've read the books and that analytical internal process? And then at an organizational level, I do that with folks on how do we build accountability systems and organizational structures that reflect those values. Which is fun to be a lawyer, because then I can talk about how corporate structures and legal structures sort of inform that and how you subvert those. And I have a lot of fun in those conversations. Yeah. So I do a lot of work. My sort of tagline with Torchlight is that we talk about courage, healing, and community, that justice and equity and belonging are a product of those things. And so in every space, what does it take to speak and to act with courage as an individual? What does it look like to replicate that courage into a community that is centered on those values? And how do we heal as individuals from really the trauma that is perpetuating the systems of oppression as well as being impacted by it, right? Like there is trauma in being the aggressor, in being the privileged class. And it's a trauma that is not well understood. And so that's a big piece of what I've been researching right now and trying to integrate into practice in kind of community organizing and things like that. What does it look like to create interpersonal and community relationships that reflect liberation practices, right? Rather than to take systems of oppression and try to dismantle the master's house with the master's tools.
Yeah, awesome. Well, and a lot of people have been asking me, like, how can we support you, Natasha? How can we help? I'm really passionate about, helping people like Jennifer. So if you were upset by something that happened to me, make a donation to Jennifer's, foundation.
You can donate to Torchlight Justice. We're starting some new projects down at the border. So I live in San Diego near Tijuana, and I do a lot of work with organizations here with refugees and children and families at the border. So that's a good place to start.
If that's something that calls to you and you want to donate, a lot of us have tithing monies. I'm not even allowed to pay tithing anymore. So I guess I got to find new places.
You have filthy lucre. I love the rule that you can't pay tithing with filthy lucre. But you can with But you can with MLM earnings.
Right. But yeah, that's actually one of my projects. I hope to have like a website or something on my page where I feel like there's worthy causes that a lot of post-Mormons or nuanced Mormons want to donate and participate financially and help that are worthwhile. And I think, yours definitely meets that. So anyway, I will be in touch.
Yeah, we'll be talking more.
And hopefully you'll be a guest again, because I think you've been lovely. And I hope everybody has enjoyed our conversation. And I'll probably be co-hosting this on both Mormon Sex Info and Mormon Mental Health, because I think it applies to both.
Yeah.
And please donate to my podcast as well, so that I don't have to pay out of my own pocket to pay for the internet site. That's pretty much where I'm at. Anyway, but yeah, so help post-Mormon women wherever you find them, or Mormon women, who are good,
or just women,
or women, right? So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been so fun.
I really appreciate your very valuable time shared with us tonight. Thank you.
I appreciate it. It's so great to talk to you. Have a great night.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me, unknown ways before me roll, hiding rock and treacherous show, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
As a mother stills her child, thou canst hush
Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Boisterous wave, obey thy will. When thou sayest to them, be still. Wondrous sovereign of the sea, Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore, and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot thee. Twixt me and the peaceful rest, then while leaning on my breast, may I hear thee say,